Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to learn how we can create a melody on top of a chord progression. Anyways, the first thing, let's actually listen to the melody that I created, and then we'll go ahead and start breaking it down and hopefully learn a few things. Fingers crossed. Alright, so that's the little melody that I came up with. We can hear there's a lot of different things going on. We have contrast between short notes and long notes. Vertically, we have a lot of movement going between, 1.5 octaves. And also there's variations within the rhythm throughout the entire melody itself. Now you can hear that there's these notes in there that are called grace notes, and I like to use those stylistically, but please understand you don't necessarily have to have these. Let's talk about one of the first things we need to think about when writing a melody, and that is actually thinking about chord tones. Chord tones are going to be like the foundation for your melody. In the same way that drums and bass are the foundation for your chords and also for your timing, the chord progression itself can be the foundation for your melody. Now keep in mind, you don't actually have to have chords behind a melody. You can either have just the melody itself, and you can even have just basic intervals underneath it. And both of those are perfectly okay. But in this case, it's more common to hear a progression underneath it. And looking at this chord progression and melody in more detail, you can definitely see that we do have chord tones within the melody itself that are being highlighted. And it's important to really start to think about how to do these things, because using these chord tones are going to help anchor your melody and give it a real sense of place. And not only that, you can really think about what chord tones you would like to highlight, which will also dictate whether the melody is going to feel like it really resolves or if it has more tension. So for example, if we were to land on the root note, or we were to land somewhere on the fifth, those are like very safe landing spots that are going to allow you to just kind of like resolve that melody nice and clean. Alternatively, you can go into different areas like third, sixth, seventh, ninth, 11th, 13th. You can get really crazy with this sort of stuff and start to really think outside the box. But it's important to know that we're really trying to stay grounded within the chords. And even when we're doing runs between notes, we're still trying to reference little bits and pieces of the melody itself. And that's definitely very important. Now, of course, you can see here, these are chords with a lot of verticality and things being stacked on top of each other. But you don't have to do it that way. You can have like a triad, say C major, or we can just think of these chords here where it's only these 3 notes. And we can just sort of think of all of these notes on top of it, highlighting what the extensions of the chord would be if it had those notes. So say the chord included a 7th, which is going to be the C here. We can think of that as highlighting more of a 7th sort of tonality. Or if we wanted to add a 9th, which is this right up here, we could think of it emphasizing the 9ths, the 11ths, the 13, and like when you get more advanced, you could think about sharps and flats, or as you can think of augmented and diminished, and it gets more crazy and interesting. But in this case, we just want to think very straightforward about it. Now, I like to use chords that have a lot of vertical stuff going on, just because to me and to my ears, I like the harmony and I find it more interesting. But, music is subjective and there's no right or wrong. Okay. So now we have the concept of kind of following our chord tones, right? And you can see this is pretty much referenced throughout the entirety of what I have composed here. The next thing that we want to start thinking about when we're writing our melody is taking into consideration verticality. Now, music you can think of as almost like an axis, where you have horizontal movement and you have vertical movement. So vertical, you can think of melody, and horizontal, you can think of rhythm, or also the length of notes too. Now, you can see here that we are not venturing out too crazy. We're staying mostly within 1 octave, but we're still trying to create contrast and movement between the notes. So as you can see here, there's never like a jump that follows the scale entirely. So say you have C, D, E, F, G, A, B. We're not going C, D, E, F, G, A, B. We're kind of skipping between notes, and we're creating space. And doing that is just going to be more interesting to the listener. There's definitely times you might want to run up the scale or reference little pieces of the scale. That's super common and it's very important to know. But it's also, and try to think about maybe moving things sort of in spaces or in intervals. So you can think of, I'm going to go from the root note of the scale to the fifth, and then I'm going to the seventh, and then the ninth. And you can start to really think about different patterns and start to include these almost like a Lego set when you're making music. It just sort of helps you, gives you an idea of what you can really do, and just gives you a foundation to work on, so you're spending less time fiddling and more time just getting your idea out there. As we look more into this melody, we can even start to dissect it on a more microscopic detail. So you can see here I have these grace notes, and there's a lot of different options you can have with these two, which we'll go into in a minute. But what you can see here is that as we're moving upwards, we're kind of keeping it gentle. And this is just mostly just improvising and seeing what works. But you can see we're still creating contrast. We have our D, which is going to be a pretty safe note to play. And then we're moving up to our seventh and going in between like the root of the chord and the seventh of the chord here with the E and the F. And with doing this, we're playing with natural notes on the scale that have tension and release. And then also because we have this chord, we're kind of emphasizing that on top of the chord. And then we finally make our way up to our G, which in this part of the solo is going to be the highest place we reach. And we could go higher, but I decided to keep the beginning part a little bit more mellow and to branch out more as the solo goes on, or the melody goes on. And again, we work our way down, and you notice that we have a lot of spacing in between everything that's happening. Since we're in the key of C major, we have all of these white notes to work with, and you can see that we're actually trying to take some time and really skip notes. And by doing this, you're just creating space and making it more interesting than just going up the scale in a more robotic fashion. And that's going to be another thing that's important to think about when you're making melodies when it comes to being vertical. Try spacing out notes more and not kind of keeping it within like a small box when it comes to moving. That's not to say it isn't important to use scales. And in a lot of soloing and even within melody structure, you can use arpeggios and things like that. But that's for another video. Then we take our solo again. However, instead of only stopping at G, we decide to venture out a little bit more. So what we're doing is we're contrasting this first half of our melody with the second half, and we're venturing out more into unexplored territory. So basically this first and second half, even though there's a lot of similarities between them, we're sort of kind of creating more interest and feeling like we're going somewhere. Even if this little melody is looped over and over, just we have enough contrast to where you can hear it loop and it doesn't get old really quick. And also it has identity. And once again, you can see, just like before when we hit our peak, we decide to descend back down and work our way back down and finally resolve nice and calmly on our A again. Now you can see I definitely have this theme of resolving down to our fifth in the chords that we're playing essentially. Even though technically it's not in this, it's the fifth note of the scale, which is a nice relaxing note. It's not bad to land on. It's a very safe note. You don't necessarily have to do this. You could even create the inverse of this. You could have it build up tension towards the end and then resolve it at the beginning of the next phrase. There's many different ways you can approach this, but in this case I decided to go with the nice smooth up and down, up and down. Okay, so we got that out of the way. Now let's cover the grace notes. This is sort of a benefit that maybe might interest some of you. Now you can see I used a lot of grace notes and embellishments here. They're pretty much all over the place, and it's something I just like to do. I find that it sounds really interesting and unique, and here's kind of why I think it's something you might want to explore a little bit when it comes to creating your melodies. Doing this sort of stuff you can hear in classical, but it's going to be more common that you hear grace notes and stuff like this, and I guess you could say like more jazz-oriented music. But it's definitely made its way into pop and tons of other genres, so it's not only exclusive to that. But by doing little things like this, we're actually creating little microcosms of tension and release within our solo. So we have this global idea of tension and release, but we can focus on in, and as we get closer and closer into what's happening in our melody, we start to have little bits of tension and release. One important thing to note is that when I am using these notes, I'm actually kind of following within the scale, and I wanted to do this because it would be more simple for explaining purposes, and also it would keep it a little bit more melodic. However, there are points you can see here where we're venturing outside of the scale. And when you're moving things outside of the scale, and for example, like a semitone like this creates a lot more tension. And it's going to have a lot more of a feeling of release. It's almost this creating a feeling of being slippery. And where you create the grace notes is completely up to you. I generally like to, honestly, I just tend to mess around with a lot of it and sort of experiment where that tension and release fits best. When you're improvising or like doing it on the spot, it's going to be a little bit different, but when I'm writing it, I try not to cluster too many grace notes next to each other. But that's more of an advanced concept. I don't want to go into too much, but I hope this little teeny bit that I have explained to you gives at least some clarification as to what's happening. And we can even think of, I'll have a version of this melody without the grace notes for download, so you don't even have to worry about these, and you could just think about the melody without them. How do we think horizontally? So when it comes to writing a melody, or pretty much anything in music, I think rhythm is something that's incredibly important, and that's especially with melodies. A rhythm can really make or break a good melodic structure, and by varying up the melody rhythmically, you can create a lot more interest and a lot more contrast, and you can kind of create like a contrast of horizontal and vertical that really is just more interesting. So one of the ways we can really make things interesting is to think about the concept of syncopation. For those of you that might not know kind of like the term of it, syncopation is basically when you're following behind the beat. So for example, you have 1, 2, 3, 4. Syncopation would be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So we're following on that second half of the quarter note. Technically it would be an eighth note, but we're just kind of following behind the 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is a very, very strong technique to keep things interesting. And we sort of utilize this throughout the solo. And we'll kind of explain that as we get there when we're kind of going through it. So you can see here we're starting on a stressed part of the beat, which is on the 2. And we're sort of using a contrast between eighth notes, as you can see here, but we're also using elongated notes. So you can consider this to be like a half note, a little bit longer, but in that half note range. We're going again back here to what we can consider this like an eighth note and another eighth note, followed by what's essentially similar to a quarter note, down to 16th, and then so on. But as we look at this more globally, you can see there's this contrast that's happening in between. We have several faster notes, followed by a slower, by a faster, a slower, then even faster notes here at 16ths, then it slows down completely. So you can see here there's like some contrast. However, right here in this section there's a lot of contrast because we have 2 very long notes kind of squished in between 2 shorter ones. So this is something that can add a little bit of surprise and interest within your melodies. And you can see how we're using syncopation by following the end of the beat on a lot of these elements. So by using this syncopation, we're sort of creating more interest on top of that contrast between the rhythms. And we can see this happens here too. We kind of reference the beginning of the melody that we had, and it's that similar feeling of contrast and release until we get up to this part where we really start to push boundaries in terms of that contrast between very long notes and very short notes. So here we have a next succession of 16th notes essentially, again followed by a quarter note, and then 32nd notes. So you can see like we're really creating contrast here too. We have like a little group of 16th notes followed by a note that's longer, a group of 32nd notes which also falls on the syncopated part of the rhythm, again by a quarter note, and then another grouping of that followed by another elongated note. Now there's a lot that we can delve into here, so I don't want to get into it too much, but what we can kind of see is happening is that we're really just thinking about creating contrast horizontally within our melody. And just like I was talking about vertically how we ventured more up and down, as the melody went on we ventured and explored more horizontally and thought about sort of these, and you could really exemplify it by the addition of these little passages of notes here. And that's sort of where the everything starts to come together and you get a nice contrast between the beginning of the melody and towards the end of the melody, and it doesn't really get old because there's always something moving and changing a little bit. Okay, so the very, very last thing we need to think about, and we're finally through the very basics of understanding creating melodies, and that is the concept of call and response. So when it comes to making music, this was something that also really helped me a lot and still helps me, and that's thinking of when you're writing something, that there's a call and a response. So for example, if we look at the solo, we can kind of break it down in the sense of there was something said here in this area by the melody, which was then answered by this. And we had something that was said around, in this first area of the melody, which was then answered by the second half of the melody. So what you're doing is sort of creating a conversation between little phrasings of notes. Because if you think about it, everything that's happening here is a phrase. You have little sentences, which include words, that then create a phrase. The same thing here, sentences and syllables, that then form a phrase. And that's how I think you can really think about it. Not to get too crazy off into the distance, but depending on where you come from, it actually affects how you compose your music. The way you speak definitely has a big influence on the rhythms you use. And when you're writing music, it's something we have subconsciously, but we can still use that in terms of just on a, like I said, some subconscious level to help improve the way we're expressing ourselves and our melodies. So, in a way, sometimes the way you compose might express how you speak. And I think that's a really beautiful way to think about making music, is sort of just through the day-to-day interactions that we all have. As I guess you could say as individuals. And to me, it's a combination of all of these things, and of course, plenty of practice that really helps create a melody that's going to be interesting and compelling, not only for you as the composer, but also for the listener on the other end. And it's these little things that help you as an individual speak out and create your emotion towards those who are listening. Not all of us are going to have singers on our music, and I think by using melodies to help convey what we feel inside, it can feel very cathartic in its own way. But that's just my personal opinion, and there's many different ways we can approach melodies, and through future videos we're definitely going to do much more exploration of this. But I just wanted to create something not super complex to start out with. And also, thank you so much everyone for all the wonderful subscriptions to my channel. I was not expecting to gain like 100 plus subscribers, and I hope that all the rest of my videos, including this one, are going to be helpful to you. And I have a lot of ideas that I would like to pursue, but I figured this would be another way to start out when it comes to just creating, I guess, the basics. But as time goes on, we'll start going into more advanced topics when it comes to music composition, and we're also going to look into things like, of course, mixing and the technical side of music too. But I just want to start out with this sort of content right now. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I really hope this video has helped you out. If you had any confusion or any criticisms of the video, feel free to let me know. It can help me improve future videos. Alright, thank you guys so much, and I hope to see you in the next video.